Princess Velira stood tall, her golden armor gleaming under the bright lights of the royal palace. The grand hall was filled with the murmurs of the royal court, the whispers of intrigue, and the heavy silence of expectation. Velira could feel the weight of her father's decision bearing down on her shoulders. Today was the day her life would change forever. A marriage arranged for political gain. A union meant to strengthen the bond between the Gennari Empire and the Earth Alliance. But for Velira, it was an insult. To her, the very idea of marrying a human was beneath her. Humans, in her mind, were primitive creatures. They were weak, disorganized, and had no place in the sophisticated and highly advanced world of the Gennari. Yet here she was, standing in the center of the grand hall, awaiting the arrival of the man she was supposed to marry. She could feel the eyes of the court on her, and the weight of their judgment pressed down on her even more. As the heir to the Gennari throne, she had always been the center of attention, but this was different. Today, she wasn't just a princess. Today, she was a pawn. Her father, Emperor Thaler, had made the decision for her. There was no room for argument. Her personal feelings didn't matter. The alliance with Earth was crucial for the survival of the Gennari Empire, and the marriage of Velira to a human soldier was part of that plan. It didn't matter that she hated the idea. It didn't matter that she had no desire to bind herself to someone she considered beneath her. The doors to the hall opened, and in stepped Captain Darius Blake. Velira's gaze locked onto him immediately. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling the doorway as he entered. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and his uniform, a sleek, form-fitting suit of Earth design, looked strangely out of place in the grand, ancient palace. His eyes met hers, and there was something in his gaze that made her pulse quicken, though she would never admit it. Darius Blake was a human, yes, but he was no ordinary soldier. He was a highly decorated officer, a man of great renown among his people. But that didn't matter to Velira. To her, he was just another pawn in her father's game, another obstacle in her path. As he approached her, Velira forced herself to keep her expression neutral. She refused to show weakness, refused to let him see how much she despised the situation. She had been trained her entire life to be strong, to be regal, to be unshakable. And she would not allow a mere human to break that. The ceremony began, and Velira was guided through the ancient ritual. She held her head high, her back straight, and her eyes focused on the distant throne. The words were spoken, the vows exchanged, but Velira's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the man standing beside her, Darius Blake. His presence filled the room, and every time their hands brushed, she felt an odd sensation, a jolt of energy that shot through her like a spark of lightning. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, but she knew it was real. His touch, though light, seemed to burn through her skin, igniting something deep inside her. She flinched at the sensation, but it was fleeting. It was only a touch, after all. But when the ceremony was completed, when the crown was placed upon her head and the bond was sealed, Velira couldn't shake the feeling. It lingered, like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. She had no time to dwell on it, though. The celebrations would begin soon, and she had to be the perfect princess, the perfect bride. But as the crowd erupted into applause, Velira felt the tug of something she didn't understand, something that made her question everything she had believed about humans. And more importantly, it made her wonder about the man she had just married. After the wedding ceremony, Velira was led to her new chambers in the royal palace. Her father, the emperor, had arranged for her to share these rooms with her new husband, Captain Darius Blake. The palace was grand, as it always had been, but today it felt cold and distant to her. The walls seemed to press in on her, reminding her of the life she no longer controlled. The grand hallways that once filled her with pride now seemed endless, stretching in all directions like a maze she couldn't escape. She had always enjoyed the beauty of her home, the tall marble pillars, the shimmering glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, and the intricate carvings that told the history of the Gennari people. But today all of it felt foreign, as though she were trapped in a cage of her own making. Darius followed her, his footsteps quiet but steady behind her. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Their silence hung heavily between them, a strange, unspoken tension that neither could shake. Velira had been prepared to despise him. She had been prepared to resist him with all the strength she had, to stand firm in her belief that he was nothing more than an obstacle, a pawn in her father's plan. But now, as they walked side by side, she wasn't so sure. Her thoughts were interrupted when they reached the doors of her chambers. The guards bowed as they opened the doors for her, and Velira stepped inside. The room was lavish, as expected, furnished with the finest silks, the most beautiful rugs, and gleaming gold accents. But none of it mattered to her. None of it could erase the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in her chest. Darius stepped inside after her, his presence filling the space. He looked around, his expression unreadable, before turning his gaze back to her. Velira stood still, her back straight, her eyes cold. She wouldn't allow him to see her weakness. "This is your room, your highness," he said, his voice calm, respectful. "I will take the adjoining quarters as arranged." Velira didn't respond immediately. She was still trying to push down the strange feelings that had started to surface ever since their hands had touched during the ceremony. It was a sensation she couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. His touch, his skin against hers, had sparked something inside her, something she couldn't explain. "I don't need your protection," she said finally, her voice sharp. "I can handle myself." Darius didn't seem offended. Instead, he nodded. "Of course, princess. But I will remain close, as per the terms of our agreement." Velira turned away from him, unwilling to meet his gaze. "Leave me," she said. "I wish to be alone." He hesitated for a moment, but then nodded again. "As you wish." He turned and left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Velira stood by the window, staring out at the sprawling gardens below. The bright colors of the flowers, the peaceful stillness of the palace grounds, it should have brought her comfort. But it didn't. She felt restless, as though she were a part of something she couldn't control, something that was far beyond her understanding. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Darius. She couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he had looked at her during the ceremony, the way his touch had felt. It wasn't like any touch she had ever experienced. It was warm, electric, and it made her heart race in a way she couldn't explain. And yet, she still resented him. She hated the fact that her father had forced this upon her. She hated that she was now bound to this human, a soldier from a distant planet. She had no choice in the matter, and that made her angry. But despite her anger, there was a part of her that couldn't ignore the connection she felt when he was near. Velira paced the room, her mind spinning with confusion. She couldn't let herself feel this way. She was a princess, the future ruler of the Jannari Empire. She couldn't afford to let a human, a mere soldier, make her doubt everything she had been raised to believe. She had to stay focused. She had to remain strong. But every time she thought of Darius, that strange sensation returned. The way his touch lingered on her skin, the way his eyes had searched hers with a quiet intensity. She didn't know what it meant, but she couldn't deny that it was there. Hours passed, and Velira found herself unable to sleep. Her mind wouldn't stop racing, and the silence in her chambers was deafening. She stood by the window again, looking out at the stars that stretched across the night sky. The stars that had once seemed so distant, so out of reach, now seemed to mock her. They were a reminder that there was a whole universe beyond the palace walls, a universe that she was now tied to through her marriage to Darius. But what did that mean for her? What did it mean for the future of the Jannari Empire? Her father had promised her that this alliance would bring peace and prosperity, but Velira wasn't so sure. She had been taught her whole life that the Jannari were superior, that their empire was the pinnacle of civilization. But now, with Darius in her life, she wasn't so certain anymore. The sound of a soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Velira turned, her heart racing as she wondered who it could be. She hadn't expected anyone to visit her. She wasn't expecting Darius, but for some reason she felt the urge to see him again. "Enter," she called out, her voice steady. The door opened, and there he was, Darius, standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said quietly. "I understand this is difficult, and I don't want to impose." Velira didn't know what to say. She should tell him to leave, to go back to his quarters. But something in his voice, something in his presence, made her pause. She couldn't explain it. She didn't want to admit it, but she didn't feel as angry as she had earlier. "I'm fine," she said at last, her voice softening slightly. "Thank you." Darius nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Then, as if realizing that he had overstayed his welcome, he turned to leave. But just before the door closed behind him, he spoke again. "If you need anything, princess," he said, his voice low, "I will be here." And then he was gone, leaving Velira alone with her thoughts once more. But this time, she couldn't stop herself from wondering, what did Darius really want? And why did his presence make her feel things she did understand? The days following their wedding seemed to drag on endlessly for Princess Velira. Her mind remained occupied with the strange connection she had felt toward Darius, but she refused to acknowledge it. She had tried to bury it, to dismiss the warmth in her chest whenever he was near, but it lingered like an uninvited guest. Every time their hands brushed or their eyes met, that strange sensation surged within her, and she hated herself for feeling it. She had always prided herself on her strength, on her ability to control her emotions and to stay focused on her duty. But Darius, the human soldier who had been thrust into her life against her will, was proving to be a far more complicated presence than she had ever anticipated. And as much as she tried to ignore it, the bond between them seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Velira spent most of her time in her chambers, avoiding Darius as much as possible. She busied herself with royal duties, reading through reports from various sectors of the Janari Empire, reviewing diplomatic communications, and meeting with her advisors. But despite her best efforts to distract herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, and that change had everything to do with Darius. One evening, as the sun began to set and the palace bathed in the soft golden light, there was a quiet knock at her door. Velira had been reading a report about the unrest in the outer colonies, but she put it aside when she heard the knock. "Enter," she called out, her voice steady. The door opened slowly, and Darius stepped inside. His presence seemed to fill the room, and Velira felt her heart race for a brief moment before she forced herself to calm down. He had come to check on her again, she thought, to make sure she was still handling everything as the dutiful princess she was supposed to be. "Princess Velira," he said, his voice gentle. "I wanted to see if you needed anything. I know this is all difficult for you." Velira's heart skipped a beat at his words, but she quickly masked the reaction with a cold stare. "I don't need anything," she said firmly, her voice sharper than she intended. "I'm perfectly capable of handling myself." Darius didn't flinch at her words. Instead, he nodded, as if he understood that she was only trying to push him away. "I understand," he said quietly, "but if you ever need someone to talk to, I'll be here." His words caught her off guard, and for a moment she found herself speechless. She had expected him to retreat, to take his leave and give her space, but he didn't. He simply stood there, watching her, waiting. And despite her best efforts to remain distant, she felt her walls begin to crumble. For the first time since their marriage, Velira allowed herself to look at him without the bitterness and anger that had colored her thoughts. She really saw him, his strong, steady posture, the way his dark eyes reflected the weight of a lifetime of experiences, the quiet strength he carried within him. There was something about him, something that drew her in despite everything. "You're different from the others," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The others I've met, they would never have stayed." Darius's expression softened, and he took a step closer to her. "I made a vow to protect you, princess," he said quietly. "That's what I intend to do no matter what." Velira's chest tightened at his words. She didn't know why, but his presence seemed to settle something inside her. She had always been so sure of herself, so confident in her place in the world. But now, standing before this human soldier, she felt something she had never felt before, uncertainty. She didn't know what to make of it, but it was there, undeniable. She shook her head, as if trying to clear the confusion from her mind. "This is all wrong," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't want this marriage. I didn't want any of it." Darius remained silent for a moment, as though he were considering her words carefully. Then slowly he took another step toward her. "I know this isn't what you wanted," he said softly, "but sometimes things don't turn out the way we plan. We don't always have control over our lives." Velira frowned, unwilling to admit that he was right. She had spent her entire life controlling her destiny, shaping her future with her own hands. But now, it felt as though she were being swept along by forces beyond her control. She didn't want to admit it, but Darius's presence was becoming a part of her life in a way she had never expected. For a long moment they stood there in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Velira wasn't sure what to say next. She didn't know what to think. She didn't know what to feel. But then, without warning, Darius reached out and placed his hand gently on her arm. The touch was light, but it sent a shock of warmth through her body, and Velira's breath caught in her throat. It was the same feeling she had experienced during the wedding ceremony, the same sensation that had confused her and made her question everything she thought she knew. And this time, the sensation was even stronger. Valira pulled away quickly, as though his touch had burned her. Her heart raced, and she could feel the heat rise to her face. She had to push him away. She couldn't allow herself to feel anything for him, but Darius didn't move. He remained calm, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "I don't understand it either," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet understanding. "But I feel it too, Princess. I can't explain it, but I know there's something between us, something real." Valira's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time she found herself at a loss for words. She didn't know what to say, she didn't know how to process what he had just said. But deep down, she knew that he was right. There was something between them. Something that neither of them could explain. And try as she might to deny it, she could no longer ignore the truth.